Hello, everybody. Today I'm here with David from Four Corners of the Page, and we are back to discuss more topics together because we had so much fun in our book difficulty discussion. If you missed that, check it out. I'll link it down below. And so we're going to have an ongoing series talking about various topics. So the first discussion, as I said, is here on my channel on book difficulty. We also had a second discussion that's over on David's channel that is about music in fantasy. And our discussion today is going to be about our emotional responses to stories. We're going to be talking about empathy, the role of empathy, cultivating empathy when we read, and whether that transfers into the real world, what we bring into stories, what we take from stories. And we're just going to cover this in broad strokes with some book examples. So, David, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. No, I think this is a really interesting discussion to have. Part of this is just for me as a teacher. I'm always quite keen and close-eyed on how my students are reacting to story. And I'm also just hyper conscious that we're not always aware of what stories are doing to us. We think we are. And then we realize maybe a month later, a year later, 10 years later in some cases, and I do have some examples, we find that stories have affected us, have sort of kind of risen up and kind of gotten into our brains in a way that we didn't quite realize at the time. And so it's so important to be hyper conscious and hyper vigilant and reflective and analytical and all those words, just aware of what's happening and monitoring our own responses to stories. So I think we're probably going to go all over the place, but in the best possible way. So thank you for having me.
And as far as cultivating empathy, that's
Yeah.
the question, right? Do
Yeah.
you feel like reading makes you a more empathetic person?
I mean, I want to say yes because I want to have some kind of product of all these hours I spend into reading. Um, Certainly, what reading definitely can do is it can alert you to other perspectives. I mean, we've kind of been speaking about this already, right? If I read Song of Ice and Fire, I can know what it's like to be, someone from a family who is viewed as an outcast. If I read Curious Incident of a Dog in the Nighttime, a totally different book, I can maybe read about the experience of someone on the autism spectrum. So books certainly are able to give us the ability to recognize and understand different perspectives. But that there's a jump between that and saying, what was the word you used? Forgive me, Joanna, empathy.
So
Yeah.
empathy is yes. So I think there's a difference between empathy and compassion, and there are
Yes.
actually different types of empathy. So a lot of times when researchers are talking about empathy, they distinguish between the difference between affective empathy or emotional empathy, and that's when you feel the emotions of another person, versus cognitive empathy, which is I can rationally, logically imagine myself in the shoes of another person and imagine what that situation is like, but I might not have an emotional connection to those things.
So
And then
that,
there's
sorry.
also empathic concern. And
Mhm.
empathic concern could be considered a compassion sort of situation where you not only feel the emotions of another person, but you want what's best for them. And I think that reading certainly can elicit that empathic concern. One thing that I found really interesting when I was looking into empathy in this particular book, Altered Traits, is that there was some research about this, and they found that empathy in the real world specifically, it's not necessarily conducive towards empathic concern. And in fact, they did a study where they trained two groups of people. They trained some people in empathy, which is to feel. I don't know if they actually, to be honest with you, I should probably look this up. But there were some people I think that were trained in. Yes, I don't want to say they were trained in empathy. So in order to feel the emotions of other people, but then there was a separate group that was trained in compassion or loving kindness or some sort of meditative situation where they were able to not only feel what the other person is feeling, but to wish that person safety and freedom from suffering. That's a whole other different level of engagement with emotions. And then what they did with these two groups is they showed them graphic, violent images on a screen, and the people who were trained in empathy, those people had circuits of their brain that were activated that put them in a feeling of stress and anxiety and the sense of, I want to get away from that. So if you were watching somebody burning or somebody suffering, you just want to get away from that situation.
Mhm.
Whereas the people who were trained in empathic concern or compassion, they had different circuits of their brain light up. And in fact, it was what the researchers associated with parental concern. And in those people, they left with more positive feelings in their brain light up so that they were able to be with the person suffering more, and they were able to wish them freedom from that suffering. They were able to establish those good emotions towards the other being. It's a very different network of what's lighting up in the brain between those 2 things. So empathy didn't necessarily produce the more positive result when it comes to making a change or taking action in a positive way in the world, but compassion did.
Yes.
And a lot of people talk about reading promoting empathy, and it might, but does that translate to compassion in the world and taking action in the world?
That's so interesting. I have like about four different thoughts, and they're all carrying me in different directions. I would say that yeah, this is the issue, isn't it? A Song of Ice and Fire. I can read all of this stuff, and but as you just articulated with reference to these studies, and maybe understanding does not equal feeling after closing the book, and that also might not equal actually carrying this forward in any meaningful capacity. You know what it reminds me of when you were talking? Quite more recently, a lot of my social media, the ads have sort of become activism ads. It's about different situations happening in the world today, and often a lot of these ads will start with something along the lines of, "Don't scroll past this. This is going to be difficult to see, but we need you to watch it." It's almost like the advertisers who are trying to fundraise towards these charitable ends are kind of aware of this because it's very common. The first 2 seconds is, "Don't move, don't scroll past this. We know you're seeing suffering, but you kind of need to see it." So I think you're absolutely right. I'm trying to think of examples, perhaps, of ways in which how can I say it, my own personal life has been enhanced by kind of knowledge that I've accumulated, or maybe empathy that has led to compassion. And I'm struggling, to be honest. Is that a bad thing to say? Am I a terrible person? Can you think of any examples?
Yeah, it's really tricky. I'm trying to think as well. I especially after reading this book, I started to work really hard on doing what's called loving kindness meditation. And this
Yeah,
is something what I appreciate about this book, by the way, because I know that that has a lot of spiritual, religious connotations. But the nice thing about this research and what this particular book is trying to promote is that you could use these practices and they can be considered completely secular. It doesn't matter if you're an atheist, it doesn't matter if you're agnostic or religious or Buddhist, it does not matter that these practices have specific effects on the brain. And if your value is to bring more loving kindness to the world or more compassion into the world, you can train yourself in that way and it can make changes in the brain over time. And in fact, with that one study, I think they said only 8 hours of training changed those neural circuits in the brain. So, of course, that's not gonna have long-lasting effect unless you do it every day for a long time,
yeah,
but yeah, I think it's something that you can cultivate. It's hard, though. I think it just depends. I know it does come up now and then. Like, I know that, I saw somebody having a medical emergency at one point, and I noticed that there were other people around. Because something else I learned, and I don't think it was in this book, it might have been in this book or it might have been a different paper, but I learned that another thing that affects whether you're gonna take action in the world, this is what I call the Good Samaritan effect. I think it's called that in the book, I can't remember, but this is when your willingness to take action and to help somebody in need, it can be affected by a couple of different things. One, if you're time pressed. If you're in a rush
interesting.
to get somewhere,
Yeah,
then you're more than likely going to say, "Oh, somebody else could take care of that. I can't stop right now. I can't help this person in need right now. I don't have time." So if you're in a time crunch, that can get in the way of trying to be altruistic
yeah,
in a certain situation. The other thing that can affect altruism is if you're in a crowd of people. This happened to
mm,
my husband. He was at a concert and he noticed that there were a lot of people at this concert. It was an outdoor concert. And there was somebody who seemed to be dehydrated and was I think they that fainted. And there were a lot of people around. So not a lot of people were doing much because it's like, well, somebody else can take care of this. I don't know this person. They probably have people they're with. And he noticed this and he right away said, "Hey, this person needs help." Yeah, just to be the one to make sure that they called out for help. Because sometimes if we're in a crowd, or I don't know if you've ever witnessed a car accident before, it's like, "Oh, there are other witnesses around. I can
yeah.
go. Somebody else could take care of that." So Yeah, it's a tricky situation because it can be easy to rationalize why it's not worth our time. So there are a lot of benefits, I think, to taking time to examine that part of ourselves, and maybe reading can be a way to do that. I'm not sure. I
I
do
think
love stories where people are tested in that way. I like stories where people are forced to challenge themselves to think about those questions because there are questions that come up for me quite a bit.
we could maybe say that reading will arm you with the knowledge that you need to, but you need to then take that extra step and practice that mindfulness to bring that knowledge to bear in the real world. And if I could return to maybe a curious incident of the dog in the
Yes,
nighttime,
yes, yes.
which is a book that I've taught previously. Now, Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime is a weird book. So the protagonist is trying to solve the mystery of who killed his neighbor's dog. He wakes up one morning and the dog has a pitchfork through it, and he has taken it upon himself to solve this mystery. Everyone is telling him not to. The protagonist is has quite a strong. He's quite far along the autism spectrum. I believe he has Asperger's. And so you are getting this novel from a
Mhm.
first person perspective of somebody who is kind of living with Asperger's and trying to navigate the world when socially that's very difficult for him. And this book is often taught in the UK. It's quite controversial. It's controversial for two reasons. First of all, a very bad word is used in it, which I will not say. But the second reason that it's controversial is people have different reactions as to how well the book portrays Asperger's. So some people think it's a really good representation, and some people think it's a bit too what's the word, stereotypical in a lot
Mm.
of ways. But what that text does do, just going back to the thing about seeing other people's perspectives, it clues people in on kind of what living with Asperger's might look like, in a way that I know a lot of children have never considered before. So maybe one example of that could be overstimulation. You know, people who sometimes get overstimulated, bright lights, noises, and maybe start to kind of hunker down or kind of hit themselves on the side of the head, something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
And what this book is able to do with young people, but really anyone, is explain this situation to them so that when they see this in the real world, they might have an inkling, they might have an understanding of what is going on there. But then I loved what you were saying about, that not necessarily being enough, and the different ways of empathy, and the different modes of empathy, and all the different factors that might then allow someone to go further. So I think what books can do is they can furnish us with the understanding, that first level of compassion. Forgive me. I think forgive me. What was it called?
Oh,
The empathy, based on understanding.
yeah, cognitive empathy. Mhm.
Maybe it can definitely give everyone cognitive empathy, and maybe reading by necessity you attain cognitive empathy, but then it does take that mindfulness, that 8 hours or however long it is, to push things to the next level. And I think it's an important thing to bear in mind, that it's not necessarily just a through line. I read more, therefore I am enlightened. You know what it also made me
Yeah.
think of when you were talking.
I love
Sorry.
that, by the way. I read more, therefore I'm enlightened.
Yeah, well, there is sometimes that kind of implicit thing as well,
Yes.
talking about the representations that affect us. Do you know what you made me think of, though, with the time crunch? Everyone is a lovely human being. I'm convinced that people at heart are wonderful, brilliant, um, endearing creatures, except when a plane has landed and the fasten your seatbelt sign has gone off. Have you noticed this? Whenever you get off a plane, it is every single person for themselves. People are pushing,
Oh,
people are shoving, people are like reaching over each other. And then you get off the plane. For anyone who's been on a plane, you get off the plane and suddenly everyone's walking to the gate as quickly as possible. And no one's acknowledging that there's a race going on, but there is absolutely a race going on. And people are fighting tooth and nail, totally subtextually, to get to the front of this line, because no one wants to be at the back of customs, because it takes ages. And that might be an example of when there's a time crunch. I mean, it's pretty far afield from what we're talking about, but it's what was coming up in my mind, that as soon as that time crunch exists, people can be a bit more savage with each other. So I can totally understand why there are other factors that might affect our interaction with others.
that's funny you say that. I've seen that experience, but I've
Yeah.
also seen the opposite experience too, because, well, David knows I'm really short. I'm a very short person. Even though we haven't met in person, he knows this about me. And so anytime I'm in a plane, it's kind of funny because I've been working out really hard lately to try to become stronger. And yet, despite that, because my luggage is so far up above me, there's almost always some man around who just has to like pull down the luggage for me. And or put it up for me if my husband doesn't do it first. And I think that's actually so kind.
Yeah.
You know, I'm always surprised how strangers are able to do that or willing to do that, and I notice them do it for other people too. So that's kind of like an opposite, example to what you're talking about, but I d have seen that too about every man's for himself, "Get off this plane."
Yeah. Maybe there's one or two nice people, but yeah, I think generally the time issue is a big one. And what was the other one again? The number of people being around.
Yeah,
I think that's a really interesting point as well. And you know what? Even can be a bit worse, can't it? Because often when there's a car accident, and someone else has gone to help, what does everyone else do? Well, they just sort of look. They just sort of look and kind of view it almost as an experience to be observed rather than something to actively engage in and help. So I think all
yeah.
these factors are really, really interesting.
But
Um,
back to your example of the mysterious I apologize, I'm forgetting the name.
Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime.
Okay, thank
Great
you.
title.
So as for that book, you said you've taught that book before, correct?
Mhm. Yes.
How do you go about cultivating empathy with your students?
That is such a good question. Poorly is probably the answer. I think a lot of it is getting them not just to read but to write. I think there has to be something creative here, where they have to sort of insert themselves into the process. It's that thing as well, isn't it? Where if it's just reading the text, then you can consume it, close the book, and walk away. There has to be some kind of engagement or interaction. So whether that's have you ever experienced this in the real world, and how did you react, is a good question because that will allow them to sort of bridge that gap to their own lives and maybe spot something in which they could have handled something a little bit better. Or you could do some kind of like role play, respond to the following prompt. I mean, I'll probably get away to a different example. What about maybe helping someone in a care home, for example, or an older person who maybe is in need? Have you ever gone past an old person who was struggling with their shopping, or something like that, and have you ever helped them? Might be another example. But I think either inserting them in a scenario or making them reflect on pre-existing scenarios that they've already experienced is a really good way. You've got to connect it to real life, and connect it to one's own life. I think for it to bear fruit.
Yes, so I was just curious about that because I think that there is, I like that you're trying to make it a bridge to make it
Yeah,
relevant into their own lives, and you're trying to think of different activities surrounding the text, such as role playing and maybe even different questions. But I just wonder about this too, because I think in the US, it's more, I guess for me, I remember in middle school, I didn't grow up reading that story, but a story that was commonly used, I think, in the classroom is Flowers for Algernon by Daniel
mm,
Keyes. An excellent book. I actually read the novel form last year, loved it. It's extremely emotional and, this is about a man named Charlie Gordon who has a very low IQ. He wants to become more intelligent because he believes it will build more friendships for him. It will
mm,
do more good for him in the world. And there, meanwhile, is this surgical procedure that is performed on a rat, on a lab rat, that causes this lab rat to increase in intelligence quite a bit quickly. And so Charlie undergoes this surgical procedure, and sure enough, he is becoming quickly intelligent. And what's fascinating about the book is how it's written in first person. It's an epistolary format, so it's journal entries. And you'll notice in the writing style how the writing style changes as Charlie becomes more intelligent and more aware. And you start to notice how his relationships change quite
mm,
significantly. I don't want to give away more about the book than that, but it is, I guess this is slightly spoilery. It is a heartbreaking book. It is an extremely emotionally challenging story. I believe I read the short story format when I was in middle school. I don't think I read the novel form because the novel form has some adult content in it. It's difficult to yeah, there's some difficult content in it. But I think that that was used to promote empathy, to try to understand what it's like to be somebody in a difficult situation like that and, to realize the nature of how intelligence can interfere with relationships,
yeah.
whether it's somebody who's struggling with their cognitive skills, or if it's somebody who's even on the high end of being maybe a genius, how that can be a struggle for people. And I don't know that I fully got the takeaway when I read it at the time, and I think part of that could have been the instruction around it. But I think that maybe some instructors might think, "Oh, reading a book like that, I'm not saying all instructors, but it maybe for me at the time, I got the impression that it's just gonna happen. You'll just automatically become empathetic
Yeah,
if you read the story. And I
yeah,
think that cultivating empathy is a little bit more nuanced than that. I do think that some stories are gonna elicit that response in us, right? They are going to make us feel things and put ourselves in those shoes. But sometimes I think there can be a journey of exploring that a little bit more critically. And something that I looked up at one point, or when that I learned about, is something called emotional contagion. Have you ever heard of that term before?
vaguely. If I
Yeah.
say vaguely, I can pretend like I've heard it, and then you can explain it to me, and I can bob my head like I knew it all along. Can
Yeah,
you please
that's
explain it
okay.
for me?
So, emotional contagion is very similar to empathy in a way. So, emotional contagion is to have the experience of feeling something deeply from another person, or from
Mm,
maybe you're in a crowd. This is the way I like to think of emotional contagion. Let's say you're in a concert and there's a performer and there's all this emotion and everybody's feeling one with the emotion, or people at a political rally. I mean, there are various examples like that where everybody's like, "Wow, we're all riding the wave of this emotion together." And it can feel like you're just picking up on whatever is there. And that is a real phenomenon that can
yes.
happen. And I did find an article to explain this better than I can, that emotional contagion and empathy share a core feature, a shared emotional experience. And one thing that they say that is different, however, here, empathy involves a clear distinction between oneself and others, whereas emotional contagion operates at a subconscious level without such discrimination. Instead, it relies on a form of total identification, where the feelings of the self and the other overlap, reflecting an innate ability to resonate with the emotions of others. So, in other words, if you have empathy, you are making a distinction between yourself and the other person. And you're able to discriminate those differences and understandings. And you might feel things that they are, but there's still a level of being able to understand your own self in
Yeah.
relation to that. So, like the exercises you were talking about with your students, think of a situation in your life, think about your own situation, getting them to self reflect in addition to reflect on the character and building the bridge. That's, I think, an empathy cultivating way of going about it, because you're getting them to tune into themselves. Whereas emotional contagion is just almost like osmosis, I suppose. It's a way
Yeah.
of just automatically we're going to feel this thing, and a lot of us might be in a wave of emotional contagion and not even realize that we're in that wave.
And it's also, I mean, in some ways, we're signing up for it because we're reading a book. But humans generally don't like the idea that they're being kind of manipulated into feeling a certain way. I mean, the examples that are kind of coming up, and they're not literary, but the two examples as you talk about emotional contagion that are kind of coming up in my mind are churches, where they often play like, especially kind of more modern churches, they'll play like really kind of, what's the word? Emotionally impactful music. You go to churches sometimes that have stuff like dry ice. Run away from a church that has dry ice. And then they'll pass the plate out. Not, and this is not me being overly cynical. And there's also nothing wrong with using music to kind of create a certain mood, but there is a sense in which it feels like emotional contagion is being used sometimes in these circumstances, as a form of maybe kind of manipulation. Yeah, I will say it is a wee bit manipulative. The other example I was also thinking of are comedy clubs. You know, there's a reason with comedy clubs that when you're watching a Netflix special at home, you will not laugh. You just won't. Well, you might do, but certainly I'll kind of watch a comedy special and go, huh, maybe twice. But if I go and see that same comic at a live stand-up, I will laugh. And I think it's that same thing, isn't it? Where the hubbub of the crowd kind of whips you into an emotional mood, if I'm understanding you correctly, that you kind of signed up for, but is also kind of something that's influencing you. I guess the
Yes.
question, I guess the question is, how is emotional contagion? Do we experience that with books? And if so, how does that come across in books? Is it possible to kind of be experience emotional contagion when you're reading something? Because reading is kind of fundamentally a solitary endeavor. I don't know. I don't know what you think about that.
I really wonder about this too. When I first learned about the difference between emotional contagion and empathy, it was actually in an article for music and
Hmm.
the music education specifically. And the
Hmm.
author of the article was talking about how music is sometimes used as a means towards trying to manipulate people
Yes.
to feel a certain thing. Like, it could be used for manipulative purposes and exploitive purposes,
Hmm.
whereas when you use empathy, when you're cultivating empathy in a classroom specifically, you're trying to get a sense of agency from the student. You're trying to cultivate that sense
Yes.
of them to reflect on, "What are you feeling? How do you experience this?" And then what does it feel like to be in their shoes? To build both at the same time as you're going through it. And also not to shame people for not feeling certain things, like trying to listen and explore. It's an exploratory situation. There's a lot to it. There was a lot that was explored in that one article. But I do wonder about that, especially with books. I guess the closest thing I can think of is when it comes to, like, a fandom and a lot of hype around something or this
Yes.
cultural messaging around a book. You and I are both Malazan fans, and people are talking about compassion. It's important, I think, that sure, we recognize how that plays a role in the story, but also examine it and see if we understand for ourselves the role it plays in that story rather than going along because we feel like we should, if that makes sense.
There's such a good example, and I'm trying to work out how much I can say while avoiding spoilers. I'm wondering if you know which character I'm talking about, because there's one character in Malazan Book of the Fallen. Well, there's many, but there's one who is infamous for being someone that is, let's say, neurodivergent, but also someone who everyone emotionally resonates with. Everyone gets to that character, and they're not on in the series for very long, but everyone goes, "Oh, that character, that scene with that character." Do you know who I'm talking
I
about?
know exactly who you're talking about,
Right.
yes.
Okay. I despise this character. Sorry, Erickson. Sorry, Stephen Erickson. I'm going to say it. I do not like. Well, it's not that I don't like this character. I think this character is fine. Can I say the name? You can snip it out. Okay. I'm talking about.
No, don't say it, but I know exactly who you're talking about.
Okay. 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 I'll trust you. I don't like that this character exists. I don't like ever. It's so hard to talk about because he or they could be a woman. I'm not
Right,
revealing
right,
anything.
right.
Um, he this character I feel like is almost has become used in the community as emotional contagion. I feel like people kind of experience that character's story, experience that kind of gust of emotions, and then as soon as that character is off the page, people go, "Yeah, that was a cathartic, wonderful time." But I feel like that character is either used by the story or is kind of used in the fandom as shorthand for kind of emotion and nothing thereafter. And I think it doesn't help that basically after this character is finished and their plotline is wrapped up, no one ever speaks about that character again in the series. They're just sort of that time has passed and they are put in their box. And I think that might be the best example I can think of in terms of emotional contagion.
How interesting.
Yeah.
I did
I'm
get
just
emotional over
I'm
that
gonna
character.
break the fourth wall and just type in the private chat with Joanna who I'm talking about just to
I know
confirm.
exactly who you're talking
Yeah.
about. You
Yeah.
don't even
Okay,
have
good.
to type it. I
Sorry.
yes,
Do you
I
agree
knew
with
yes,
me?
I just saw, and I knew what you were talking about.
Do you agree with me or no?
I got emotional over that character. I won't lie.
But did you think of them again in the preceding books or the following books? Or
No,
was it just kind of or was it just kind of like an emotional gust of wind and then that was it?
it wasn't it I mean, but there were a lot of gusts of wind in that in that
True.
series.
But I
This
feel
is
like that
kinda
character
hard.
is the big one. That's all feeling and then nothing thereafter. I don't know if this is kind of getting to the heart of what you're talking about, but with emotional contagion, I feel like this is the one that the fandom cumulatively goes, celebrates, but it's
Yeah,
not very much discussed thereafter.
yeah. I'm just not sure.
Yeah.
I it could be. It could be. Yeah, I'm trying to understand too. I think with emotional contagion, it is getting so identified into the feeling of something that you're like, I am this feeling. I am compassion because I am Malazan, and then not being able to make some space and look at things a little with a little bit of distance. I think that that's the more important part when it comes to emotional contagion.
It's
But I
it's the
love that you were able to create some space, and I've noticed
yeah.
that in a lot of your feelings about Malazan and why you've decided for us to do that hot takes video,
Yeah.
because you wanted to show there can be multiple angles to the experience, and it doesn't have to be just one a one-note experience, if you
So you would say
will.
that empathy is maybe the ability to, and I'm kind of repeating what you're saying, but I just want to make sure that I'm understanding. Empathy is the ability to separate oneself from the circumstance and reflect back on it, which might lead to compassion, as opposed
I
to
think
emotional
that there
contagion.
is some, yes, I think that there is some value. So, okay, let me preface it by saying this. I don't know if you've ever heard the cultural description of people being empaths. I've actually been
Yeah.
called an empath before by a friend, which was a flattering thing to say, which means, "Oh, you feel things very deeply." A lot of people use that term as like, "Oh, I just automatically feel what other people are feeling, and I didn't know I was picking up on the energies around me." That could actually be emotional contagion, is if I am understanding the term correctly, because there it is like empathy, like I said, where you're feeling what the other person is feeling, but the difference again is that with empathy, you do have a solid enough understanding of who you are and what you're feeling that
Gotcha.
you can feel those things. You can have that space to open and feel those things, but also you can also have I think there is a little bit of separation, yes. I don't know if it's incorrect to say that, but there should be a sense, like, especially in one of the articles I read, and there could be different disagreements. And again, these are evolving thoughts. I'm not saying I'm totally right about this, but my understanding is that you do have a sense of self where you're able to distinguish that even though I'm feeling deeply for this other character, there is a difference between me and this other character.
Okay.
Um, so, if that makes sense, or
I think it does make sense. Yeah.
let's use you and me. Let's say that, somebody close to you passes away, and you're sad about it, and you talk to me, and I feel really sad because I'm feeling what you're feeling, but it's not like but I also understand this is something you're going through too, and I might want to, like, maybe take the compassionate step of wanting to do whatever I can to show support and to yeah, to offer whatever support I can as a friend. But that's different than being like, "Oh my gosh, this happened to me. This is me. This is me." Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
There's a little bit of a difference there. There's a little bit of a distinction there.
So I wonder then if I'm understanding this correctly, emotional contagion in books, a better way. I think what I was saying about this character Malazan is much more just kind of getting cumulatively as a group, kind of whipped up into a frenzy. But it sounds as though maybe with emotional contagion, the better link here is immersion in text. And I wonder if people
Mm,
who can maybe get immersed in text very fully are more likely to experience emotional contagion, and maybe people who are maybe I don't want to say more analytical, but maybe when they read it have that greater kind of step back and are kind of looking at the components of the text might be more inclined towards empathy. I mean that's just my first reaction. I could be
yeah,
totally wrong, but I
I
wonder.
just this is a big question mark for me. This is a
Yeah,
big question mark for me. I'll name a few books that I love where I
yeah.
don't feel like I am necessarily this character. So so let me give you a few examples. One is Kindred by Octavia Butler. Have you ever read that?
No,
No. Okay. Kindred
sorry.
by Octavia Butler. It follows a character named Dana. It takes place, I want to say, in the very late 70s. And Dana she's a black woman and she's in a relationship with a white man. I think that she's going to get married or she's married to a white man. And she ends up mysteriously, it's a time travel novel. She mysteriously ends up getting thrown into the past to the antebellum South where racism exists. So,
Hmm.
as she's a black free woman in the 70s, she's getting whipped into the past where she would be treated as a slave and people are treating her totally differently. And she ends up encountering a distant relative. There's a lot to the story, but we start to see how racism is. I think because we think it's so much in the past, and slavery is so much in the past. I think the idea of the book is that slavery is a thing of the past, and we've progressed so much here in the present. But it's showing how racism has it's insidious. It's has a presence. It's the past doesn't necessarily go away, that it
Okay.
comes through in ways in the present. So I think that that's what the time travel is to represent, though the time travel is never fully explained. But it's a powerful novel. And Dana is one of the most resourceful survivor characters I've ever read from. And can I, am I Dana? No, I'm not a black woman living in the late 70s, but I can feel connections to her character. I felt upset for her character. I yeah, I felt a spectrum of emotions reading that book. And so I feel like there is a distinction between me, but when I'm reading it, I'm just in the emotional wave of the story. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the answer is to that. How would you say what the answer is to that? And then I could say the same thing about some of my other books I love. Stoner by John Williams.
Yeah.
Had an English college professor a Remain to the Day about an English butler, like male English butler, male college professor. These are experiences I'll never have, but for some reason, they emotionally resonated with me.
Yes. I wonder as well. I think the other thing to bear in mind in this discussion is that reading is not necessarily a one and done thing. You could read something for the first time and experience maybe kind of the more kind of emotional side of things and kind of get invested and not be fully aware of why you're feeling certain things. You're just kind of caught up in the, if I'm using the term correctly now, emotional contagion of the thing. But then you also have that ability, right, to go back to the beginning and reread. And sometimes I wonder, I don't know if you agree with me with the things like BookTube, we're always trying to get to the next book, but so many texts, actually, when you do that second reading, that's when you begin to actually pick apart the things that are going on. You can understand the story better, you can understand the thematic concerns better, but also you can understand where you're coming from better, because the first time often is just a bit more of kind of an emotional ride, and it's only once you do that second reading that the kind of reflective analysis that you want to do begins to come through, and you can kind of begin to identify what's going on there and what has been going on inside your head. So I'm trying to think of texts off the top of my head that do kind of do that. I think Stoner is a really good example of this, because the first time I read Stoner, I was reading it for pure experience. And again, I don't want to kind of get into plot and spoilers, but I just kind of read it and felt the feelings towards the main character that you're supposed to feel, which a lot of the time is upset, to be honest. But it's only going back and reading it that second time and thinking, okay, why was I upset there? And more importantly, why is there another angle to this? Let's say Stoner's being treated horribly by a certain figure in his life. And again, I'm trying to be a bit vague here. Is there another angle of looking at this? Am I too closely tying myself with Stoner when actually the character that is hurting him is actually experiencing things that I wasn't picking up on the first time? So I think that first emotional reading is totally valid. And in fact, some of the best reading experiences and the biggest realizations you'll get is from reading a book the first time. But that reread can also help you sort of unspool your own emotional reaction and then allow you to kind of garner further thoughts and further reflections. And I would say actually further empathy. I think my second reading of Stoner is where all the empathy came from, when the first time it was just sort of more of a broad ball of feeling.
Oh, that makes me so happy that you reread Stoner because I
Yeah,
love that book so much.
great book.
Now, what I would say to that, I do agree with everything you're saying about rereading.
Yeah.
I think this is why I know I've heard a lot of people refer to me recently as analytical, but I think this is why I love exploring themes in stories. Because when I think about why I get so emotional over reading Stoner or Remains of the Day or uh, or Octavia Butler's Kindred, when I think about why I get emotional about these things, a lot of times they speak to themes, and themes for me are they're the human condition aspects of the story that transcend the story, that transcend the human experience, that are the human experience in a broader way that we can all connect to. And so sometimes if I can go back in my mind even and identify what those themes are, they can make me realize why I resonate so deeply with them. And
Yes.
something that I love in story is when a theme isn't just so cookie cutter and obvious, when we can explore different sides of that. So it's not always, like I mentioned with the mole as an example, like compassion, I am compassion, that
Yeah.
there can be another side to that too. And it is explored in various aspects. So for me, that's where I feel like I can make the distinction between, "Oh, why am I resonating with this so deeply? How," and then I do what you do. How does this theme apply to my life? How am I in some ways like Dana or not like Dana, or how am I like Stoner or not like Stoner? Even though I feel like I'm different than those people, something in me is connecting to them. And I try to identify what that is thematically. Usually themes I feel like are the keys to unlocking what that is.
Yeah, I think I've kind of got two things to say to that. I mean, and the first thing is I think you're absolutely right about books that. I mean, I often use that word didactic, and there are a couple of books that are didactic and good, books that are giving you a lesson with a capital L. But I think both of us, and part of the reason we get on and we kind of have similar taste in books, is we gravitate away from those. I think Malazan is actually a great example, because people, and I think Erickson himself has talked about Malazan as being an exercise in compassion and empathy. But I think what makes Malazan so brilliant in that regard is it doesn't just say compassion equals good, sacrifice equals good. It takes each of these concepts apart, re-examines it like a multifaceted gem, and then kind of offers that gem to you. It doesn't just say, here is your lesson for the day, eat it. And I think that's so important when we're trying to kind of understand our own reaction to a text and what we can then take from that text. But the second thing that I wanted to bring up as well is, I think this is why I so deeply appreciated your slow reading video that you made. Because first of all, I'm just going to plug it here for a second. There's no
Thank
reason
you.
not to do a good plug. But second of all, it's that idea of having to slow down and consider our reactions to something. And this is from someone who just made a 10 books in 10 days video. It's so important to take that space and in whatever way, maybe a journal or any other system, reflect on what your reading experience has been. You've got to give yourself that space, both in the speed of your reading and in the pauses that you take between your reading, whether that's audiobook or reading or what have you. So I think that's a really important thing to bring up as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you, by the way. Thank you so much for appreciating my slow reading video. I loved your 10 books in 10 days video. Absolutely loved it. The fact that you can go between so many different experiences within a short amount of time, you could start to see broader connections between what you're loving, or maybe even just noting the diversity of what you can connect to.
But you know something interesting about it. So you recommended to me Foster by Claire Keegan, and I've
Yes.
told you that I've read it twice, which sounds
Yes.
impressive, but it's about an hour and a half long. But one of the reasons I listened to it twice is the first time I listened to it, I was listening to it on like 1.8 speed at about 1 in the morning. And I got to the end of it and I went, I understood that story completely. Like if I had to write an essay on it, I feel like I could. I think I've missed stuff. I think there's more to unpack here. I don't think I let that story settle properly. And so I went back to the beginning and I listened to it one more time. It still wasn't 1.0, it might have been 1.2. But I needed to slow down and listen to it one more time for, I think, the emotional resonance to carry through. I mean, we talked about emotion being on the first read. That was the inversion for me. And I think it was because I took it too quickly. But also to consider each character from each angle and consider a lot of the subtext that's going on in that story. And it just goes back to so much of what you were saying in your video. I mean, your video was also kind of more about your personal journey as being a slow reader. But I think what a lot of people were saying in the comments as well is that taking the time to slow down and reflect is vital for successful reading. We cannot just blow through texts, move on to the next one, move on to the next one, and perhaps glean as much as we otherwise could have. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Oh, I love that. That's so fascinating because that you went back and you took time to consider all the character perspectives.
Yeah.
And see, that's what I think that's taking empathy to another level. It's one thing to just have an emotional experience over the child perspective in that story, and
Mm.
maybe like the book does its work because I'm feeling this thing. But instead, you're actually taking the time out of your own out of your own volition to understand the perspectives of all these other characters. That's something that's not automatic. That's something that
No.
you choose to do. So that enriches your reading experience.
I mean, I've also told you about the Dresden Files one, right, privately, where I was listening to one of the Dresden Files books. I was listening to it at like something crazy. I don't normally do this, but I was jogging, and often when I'm running, I feel like I need something in my ears to distract me. I don't tend to do music; I tend to do story, and I also get more distracted if the story's faster. So I was listening to this Dresden Files book at something like 2.5 times speed, which is it's not something I do typically, and it's something I've never done since. Because what happened with that Dresden Files story is I, again, understood it completely, got every single word inside my brain and comprehended it. But minor spoilers for the Dresden Files, in as much as someone dies at some point in the Dresden Files. A character died during my reading experience while I was jogging, and I felt nothing. And it was nothing that Jim Butcher did poorly. I just was consuming the text too quickly, that I didn't have a handle on anything beyond the surface meaning. Not even the emotional contagion, if we want to call it that, or my emotional response. Even that was stunted by the speed through which I was consuming this text. And it's again why I come back to slow reading. And you mentioned in your video, people who who kind of say to you, no, I think slow reading is a strength. I'm one of those people. I really think slow reading is a strength because I've gone the opposite way and regretted it with the Dresden Files case and the case of Foster. So there is something about slowing down
Yeah.
and allowing yourself the time to respond and reflect and consider. And there's another thing I wanted to kind of pick your brain about in that regard, which is you go an extra step beyond that, which is your journaling. And do you find that your journaling is a good way for you to sort of gather your thoughts and deeply consider what's going on? Is it more kind of analytical, your journal, or is there also an emotional response baked into that?
I think it really helps me to look back and identify themes more
Mm,
broadly because I have a marginalia aspect to my journal. It's not just processing what I read, but it's also looking at some key things that are coming out in the story. I'm not the most analytical when I'm trying to identify those things. I just kind of do it broad strokes really fast. So I'm actually, I could probably take that further if I wanted to, but I don't. I
mm.
just do it daily and it adds up so that by the time I finish the book and I start looking back at some of the key words in my marginalia of my reading journal, I start to realize maybe just some of the specific things that stood out to me in the story, whether it was maybe the atmosphere or tone or noticing again the specific themes or any specific aspects of the story. So I feel like, yeah, it helps me to integrate the story in a deeper way because I do that. And even just the process of writing helps
Mhm.
me to process the story a little bit more. It does. So I love that technique for multiple reasons. So I will say I'm not analytical when I'm reading stories though. I want that to be very clear unless I'm reading Gene Wolfe. And then I might be overanalyzing every sentence because it's really hard for me to read Gene Wolfe and just a smooth experience have a smooth reading experience, especially for the last book I read.
You
But
sent
for
me a
most
page of Gene Wolfe, and I had to read it about 5 times to make any sense of it.
Did you really?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's not so simple for me either, but I have noticed that, for most books, I try not to think too hard about what I'm reading most
Mm.
of the time. Sometimes, like I said, there are some examples that are really difficult to do that. I try to just read the text, and then I might highlight something that stands out that I wanna go back and remember later when I'm writing about it, but I try not to overthink it, and then and yeah, the reading journal helps me to process it and maybe think about it more deeply, but I don't like analyzing while I'm reading. I sometimes feel like that gets in the way a little bit.
Yeah. It's difficult. I feel like we're kind of banding back and forth here because we're talking about both analysis and emotional response, and I think it's key to, as you've just pointed out, there's nothing wrong with having an emotional response to a text.
No.
In fact, that's part of the reason we read, right? Is to have an emotional response to a text. Otherwise, we would all be reading flipping cookbooks and dense philosophy. Um, an emotional response is part of it, and actually an emotional response is a key component in building empathy. It's not just kind of recognizing what's kind of going on and breaking it apart. You kind of need to have both if you're willing to then take that and try to carry it forward into the real world. Otherwise it's just abstract.
That's a really good point, David.
I'm very good.
No, I I've never thought about this particular topic in terms of reading and empathy. But let's say you were brought up in a culture where, I mean, this is very common, right? For men to be brought up in cultures where they are told not to cry,
Yeah,
that's boys don't cry.
yeah.
And then you feel uncomfortable with sadness and
Yeah.
feeling that emotion. So when you read books and a character is sad, would that make it hard to connect to that character? Or would there be resistance to connecting to that character because that character is sad? I'm
I
talking down an emotional level. You might be able to
yeah.
do it cognitively.
I often wonder as well. I mean, I don't really have a clear answer to that, but it does make me think as well. Is that maybe why reading is often considered, or has traditionally been considered, a bit more of kind of a feminine pursuit?
Is it?
Um,
Is that true?
do you think so? Because I
No.
often I think from, maybe this is just what what I have kind of gathered through osmosis through my life, is that people often view reading as either something very nerdy or something feminine.
You know
Um,
what? I think you're right, but
yeah,
I do wonder if that's more of a recent phenomenon.
you think?
'Cause yeah, because look at all the classic books. They're mostly written by men.
But I'm more thinking of the readers, the readership. And when we think of like a reader, it's either seems to be someone who looks a bit geeky, or it's someone who is female.
I
I'm
think
trying to
that
think of
that's recent. I think
yeah.
that's recent because I and I don't know this for sure, but I mean, I even heard recently that at one point women weren't taught to read, that was
Yeah.
more just men.
It could be, but that is interesting, isn't
And
it?
that's changed. And
Yeah.
nowadays, you see a ton of videos on YouTube about why men don't read.
Yeah. But I don't really tend to think of, when I think of a reader, I don't kind of think of some kind of like dude with his big thick arms, sort of like reading a book and kind of getting his nose stuck kind of into the pages. Another representation maybe that has affected me, throughout my life, but it is. I wonder if the reason that I have, at least personally, have had that construction in my mind is because of that thing where reading creates an emotional response, and men are typically seen as unwilling to kind of lean into their emotional response toward things.
Mhm.
It's interesting that we have different reactions there, though. I mean, again, it shows that the different things that we maybe have consumed through our lives and our makeup have kind of led us in these different directions.
Yeah, I find this topic so fascinating, but
Yeah.
I mean, just to bring it back to emotions, maybe like, so are you suggesting that maybe women culturally are it's more acceptable, more culturally acceptable for a woman to feel emotions, whereas maybe it's not so culturally acceptable for men, and
Sorry, I was going to tell a teaching story if you don't mind.
no, go for it. Yeah.
I once was teaching a year 7 class. So these are like 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds. And in the story we're reading, a boy starts crying. A boy starts crying, and everyone kind of went, "Oh, the boy's crying." And I thought I'd show the boys that girls don't care when boys show their emotion. It's okay. And so I said, "Boys, hands up if you've cried in the last year." And no one put their hands up. And then I went, "Boys, hands up if you would feel kind of weak or inferior if you started to cry." And all the boys put their hands up, and I'm like, "Right, I'm going to teach these boys." And I go, "Girls, put your hands up if you would judge a boy for crying." And I was expecting no hands to go up. Every single girl in that class put their hand up. Every single girl. All like 10 or 12 of them went, "Yes, we would judge a boy for displaying his emotions." So certainly, I mean, that's a very small sample size of about 25 kind of young
Yeah.
kids. But there was a thing there that really kind of shocked me, which it wasn't just, at least in that class, boys kind of viewing crying as sort of like inferior or something to be worthy of judgment, but it was something pervasive across the whole class. I don't know if I'm responding to what you're saying, but it's the story that sort of came up in my mind, that for at least this group of young people, there really was that sense of kind of this is the way things should be. Am I responding to what you're saying
Well,
accurately?
no,
Forgive me.
yeah, I think it is. I guess my bigger takeaway or question about that is whether if it's socially acceptable to feel emotions, and if we're in any sort of situation where, for whatever reason, the cultural messages we're receiving happen to be that it's not safe or it's not acceptable to feel certain emotions, then how can we do that when we're reading? And
Yes,
does that affect us when we're reading?
I think that's such an interesting point. Um, there's
And
another
before I
one.
go on, I just wanna make sure I say I full awareness that not all books are centered around characters.
Yes.
There are multiple genres and types of books that are more about, like, ideas focused or plot focused and not necessarily zooming in on the internal landscape of a character.
Mhm.
But I think for the purposes of this discussion, we are thinking about those type of narratives.
I'm thinking of another story now with a different class where it was almost like I kind of what I'm gathering from your question is like there's almost like a disconnect between our experience reading and what the character is doing, and it's almost like our own kind of social construction makes us unable to access what's happening on the page. Would that be fair?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I'm getting at. Yes, you got
So
it.
there was a so I'm going to have to spoil this book. And there's no way around it, but we can add a tag. It's also a kids. It's marketed at kids, so I think it's
That's
probably
fine.
okay.
Go
A
ahead.
Monster Calls by Patrick Ness. So I had another fascinating moment in the classroom with them, these kids, and they were brilliant, wonderful, vibrant, lovely, amazing children. Um, in A Monster Calls, the main character's mother is terminally ill. And so a lot of the conflict from this young boy in the story is him coming to terms with his own emotion in the story. He's trying to work out how he's feeling. He's trying to articulate what he's feeling. He's trying to understand what is actually going on inside himself. And the realization that the boy comes to at the end of the story, it's quite dark for a kid's book. The young boy Connor realizes and comes to terms with the fact that he loves his mother, but he also wants her to pass away. He does kind of want her to die. And he doesn't want her to die because he's sick of her, but he's sick of living in this situation where everything is hospital visits and people kind of walking around him very carefully and teachers being on eggshells. And he's so sick of that whole situation that he would prefer that he can move on to the next step. So this is the big kind of cathartic culmination of A Monster Calls, is the boy expressing this to himself and being able to say this out loud. And so we get to this point in the story where, and it's very dramatic, but the boy eventually shouts, I just want this to be over. I just want, this pain to be over. And all the kids, again, it was a universal consensus of the kids in the room, and some very, very bright kids in the room. They all went, that is so selfish. They went, I cannot believe that he would say that. I cannot believe that this boy would wish his mother dead. None of them seemed to get it. None of them seem to be able to go that extra step and say, well, the reason, the emotional reaction that he has is maybe sounds unfair, but is justified based on, and he loves his mother, but that's not the reason that he wishes her dead. He just wants this pain to be over. They just heard that thing, they heard that wish, and they had this revulsion towards it, which I thought was fascinating. And I think was the prime example that I was thinking of when you were speaking about maybe this disconnect between what a character is feeling and articulating and our own social situation. Because it took me maybe they just didn't want to do their homework and they were just having me on. But we spent about half an hour talking about that and me kind of questioning them and me trying to get them to understand why he would have said it this way, because they did not understand it. They could not connect with this character. And I think it was because of what you were just talking about, that their social makeup was causing a disconnect with the character in the book. That's
Yeah.
kind of goes to the heart of what you were saying, right?
Yes, that's exactly what I was
Yeah.
talking about. Wow.
It was a really interesting day, and I think I left having learned a lot more than perhaps they might have done. But it was a big wake up call for me that none of them got something that I thought was fairly obvious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that's the challenge when it comes to trying to cultivate empathy. Because I don't think empathy, yes, sometimes books can naturally elicit us to feel certain things for characters, or
Mhm.
it can elicit empathy, I'm sure, in an automatic way. But one, it depends on the type of story, because again, not all stories are character-driven stories. But two, I think, if you're teaching, I don't think you can just automatically rely on a book. I think there has to be additional conversation around it, and you
Yes.
have to be okay and flexible if people don't have that exact response to the book as you encountered.
Yes, I totally agree. I think if the kids were able to say, I understand where that boy's coming from, but I think he's being selfish. But it was almost like they didn't get it. There was almost like shutters went down, and they were kind of refused to acknowledge it, which is so fascinating.
That is
Um,
so fascinating.
but was quite, it did make for a very interesting half an hour conversation afterwards. But yeah, it was
Wow.
interesting teaching moment, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
But I suppose if I were to kind of just take this and move it kind of into the broader sphere, I'm sitting here judging 12-year-olds, which is my purview as a teacher. I get to judge the 12-year-olds. Um, but I'm sure in the same way, there are many times when I'm reading a book and I am not understanding a certain situation or a certain context, or maybe I'm understanding what's going on the page, but there is some kind of emotional disconnect that where the exact same thing happens that I'm not getting it. Um,
Mm.
yeah,
Yes, same with
yeah,
me, same with me. I'm sure it happens all the time. I wanna thank you so much for joining me for this discussion, David.
of course, of course. I'm more than happy. I'm delighted to.
Yay.
Yeah, I love these conversations. And I think when they go in unexpected directions and things like that as well. It's sometimes we get to the heart of things when we go off on a tangent. So yeah, just a delight, and thank you for having me.
Aw, you're welcome. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Again, please make sure you're subscribed to David's channel. It will be linked in the description below, and follow us along. We're gonna have more discussions to come.
Yeah.
So thanks again for watching, and have a great rest of your day.